So, segment 3 of chapter 6 of our behavioral neuroscience textbook, which included pages 176 to 183, started off by talking about how through evolution, vertebrate brains have changed in both size and organization. So, the text offers an example of the lamprey to demonstrate how even a vertebrate that seems like the most primitive has a very complex brain, because the lamprey has a neural chasis of a spinal cord, hindbrain, midbrain, diencephalon, and telencephalon, which includes the cerebral hemispheres and other subdivisions. And they also have a very small cerebellum, while birds and mammals have larger cerebellar hemispheres, which leads us to the question of, was this evolution because of an increased complexity of sensory processing and motor agility? The differences in the brains of vertebrate species lie in their relative size. So all mammals have a 6-layered cortex, which is an outer covering of the cerebral hemispheres, which consists primarily of nerve cell bodies and branches. And this 6-layered cortex is sometimes called a neocortex, and accounts for more than half of the volume of the brain, and is mainly responsible for higher order functions. And reptiles were the first vertebrate to exhibit a relatively large cerebral hemispheres and a cerebral cortex, but they only have 3 cortical layers, whereas, like we said, mammals have 6 layers in their cortex. So the next section, brain size evolved independently in multiple lineages, is a very short section that just briefly mentions how there is considerable variation in brain size within each line of evolution for a species. So it takes hagfishes, for example, which is a more recent member of the group of jawless fishes, and they have 4 brains that are 4 times as large as those of lampreys, of comparable body size. The next section talks about the encephalization factor. So mankind, throughout history, we've thought that our brains were the largest, but in fact, elephant brains were found to weigh 3 times as much as ours, and whale brains even larger. And mice have the same ratio of brain weight to body weight as we do, and shrews have an even larger ratio. So figure 6.13 graphs the relationship between brain weight and body weight of various mammalian species, and the linear regression slope of about 0.69. So from this graph, we may draw conclusions about how much an individual species deviates from the expectation for mammals as a group. And we also get the deviation or residual, which corresponds to the vertical distance for that species above or below the line of best fit. And this distance is called the encephalization factor, which measures brain size relative to body size. So among mammals, the encephalization factor is greatest for humans, and a bit less for chimps despite evolutionary closeness. And though our brains are larger than predicted for other animals of the same size, dolphins and birds have similar proportions, and the estimation of the number of neurons in our brains is over by 15%. So regarding the brain sizes of dinosaurs and their evolutionary tracks, the brain weights are estimated to be typical of the encephalization of reptiles. So it is, in fact, a myth that dinosaurs perished due to a lack of big brains. So the conclusion that we could draw from that last bit of this section is that, sometimes scientists make wrong conclusions. So the next section, brain size as adaptation, kind of poses the question or addresses the question of why certain species have larger brains than others. So certain capabilities are linked to sizes of particular brain regions, and when the total brain size increases, most of the major parts of the brain increase in essentially proportion, but there are slightly different rates of increase. So, for example, the olfactory bulb is a larger relative size in some species, presumably because evolution favored a developed sense of smell in those species. And the medulla becomes proportionately smaller relative to brain weight if we compare small to large brains of primates. And this suggests that the cortex has grown disproportionately over the course of human evolution. And the brain regions that have most expanded over primate evolution seem to be the regions that develop later in life and serve complex functions. So this kind of is the summary of the later but larger theory of evolution, where theorists propose that larger brains evolved by prolonging the later stages of development. And this theory may explain changes in the fine structure of the cortex and why the outer layers of the cortex of primates are more enlarged than the innermost layers. The next major section of the text is titled Many Factors Led to the Rapid Evolution of a Large Cortex in Primates. So the study of hominins, which is the subgroup of hominidae that contains modern humans and their ancestral species, as well as 4 genera of great apes, particularly the species that are ancestral to modern Homo sapiens. And this study can help us understand how our brain and body adapted to the environment through natural selection. So the first major point of this section is that hominin brains enlarged rapidly in our recent evolution. So the brain developed later than other characteristics that we consider human-like, both behavioral and structural. So the text gives us a sort of timeline, and it says that 10 million years ago, trunk and arms developed. About 4 million years ago, we became bipedal. And about 2.5 million years ago, we started producing and using stone tools in daily lives. So the early bipedal tool-making hominins were called Australopithecines, and they had relatively small brains, which were about the size of a chimpanzee's brain. And so in addition to the behavior that chimps exhibit in collecting stones to use as hammering tools, we also made and used sharpened tools for hunting and butchering animals. And this lasted about 2 million years ago, 2 million years. And about 2 million years ago, the last of the Australopithecus species developed modern features and a trend toward increasing cranial capacity. And this is where Homo erectus developed and evolved. So their brains became larger, their faces became smaller, and they started making elaborate stone tools. They used fire and killed large animals. So the fossils of these people are found throughout different continents, 3 main ones, compared to the remains of the Australopithecines, which were just found in Africa. And I'm probably saying that name wrong, so don't call me out. And about 15,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared, and their brain volume has now reached modern level, and throughout the course of their evolution, almost tripled in volume from their original brain size. And so the size of the human brain today is at a plateau. And even though all of the accomplishments mankind has made throughout history, i.e. written language, agriculture, and animal husbandry, and urban living, the brain has not altered in size. So the next section talks about the negative and positive selection pressures that caused hominin brain size to develop the way they did. So large brains hold negative pressures. The main one is that a long and burdensome gestation period and difficult birthing may occur, especially in bipeds, because the baby has to pass through a sort of narrow pelvis. But once the baby is born, the brain continues growing for years after, which on the other hand means prolonged dependence of the infant, and thus prolonged parental care. The extended growth of period of humans compared to other primates is obvious in brain weight after birth. So while the growth of the chimp brain levels off shortly after they are born, the human brain keeps growing, primarily because of cortex expansion. And though the brain makes up about 2% of our total body weight, it consumes a much bigger proportion of our metabolic budget. So just to give you an idea of why, more than half of our genes contribute to maintenance of the brain. But also, genetic messages are vulnerable to mutations, which translates to behavior disorders. So there is a fitness advantage, though, which means that there's an increased likelihood that an individual will survive and reproduce. So one hypothesis of this is that selection pressure in the social domain may have led to increased brain size, which means that the correlation between the average size of a clique or a group of individuals that regularly socialize with one another and the size of the cortex relative to brain size. So this social brain hypothesis suggests a larger cortex is needed to handle the complex cognitive task of maintaining social relationships with other large-brained individuals. And the estimation of the maximum size of a species social group from the size of the cortex. For humans, this value is 150, which is the same average number of people in many hunter-gatherer societies, as well as many functional military units, coincidentally. Another theory of positive selection pressures driving hominin brain expansion emphasizes skill development. So a major study correlated brain size in over 100 species of primates with 3 factors that may account for enhanced size of primate brains. So these factors include innovations in behavior, use of tools, and social learning. And so the brain size and relative forebrain size correlated positively with these factors, which reveals that they are related to primate brain expansion. The next section talks about how brain size predicts success in adapting to a novel environment. So the first hypothesis that the text introduces is that enlarged brains evolved as a more general adaptation to allow us to cope with sudden changes in environmental conditions. And a possible way to test this would be to introduce species with large or small brains into novel environments and see whether they would be able to establish themselves and thrive. However, this is unethical, though, because of unpredictable ecological problems with introducing a non-native species to an environment. We could also study the records of past human-mediated introductions, which a comprehensive study already did, and they studied more than 600 examples of introduction involving 195 bird species, and they found that species with larger brains tended to be more successful in establishing themselves in novel environments.